The sudden freeze of 36 came with a vengeance. It was like a wild prairie fire which snipped everything in its way, and woe to him who was far away from human habitation, for its bite was ferocious.
Let's go back to the afternoon of December 20th, 1836, less than a week before Christmas.
I'm Kyle Mulhern, an intern with the McLean County Museum of History.
I'm Bill Kemp, librarian, McLean County Museum of History.
For some reason, there has been considerable wrangling, or should I say difference of opinion, about the sudden change in the weather upon that memorable occasion.
And we believe sometime around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a cold front arrives, but just not any other cold front. It's a cold front really worthy of the Old Testament. It's described by McLean County pioneers as a raging, roaring, bellowing sound as this black cold front arrives on the scene, quote, shaking and pervading the firmament, akin to distant and heavy cannonading.
How many degrees the mercury fell perhaps will never correctly be given to the rising generation of Bloomington who think this winter if the coldest snap experienced since way back in the 30s.
Now, reports in western Illinois and elsewhere tell us that day sunrise temperatures were about 40 degrees, so a little warmer than average for the period. But by 2 p.m. in that afternoon, temperatures had plummeted to about 0.
I was in the country at the time, and I tell you, young man, you will never see such weather if you live 1,000 years.
Now, if you listen to McLean County early settlers who were off to exaggerate, they will tell us, somewhat dubiously, that the temperature dropped about 60 degrees in 15 minutes or so.
There was a lively time, and I tell you, it was necessary to skirmish around to keep from freezing to death.
The sudden change, or the sudden freeze, sweeps through a great swath of central Illinois. So we have reports of this sudden change or sudden freeze occurring as far north as Ottawa and as far south as Paris, Illinois.
The snapping of the forest trees could be heard for nearly 3 miles.
In the days before the sudden change, there had been a pretty heavy snowfall, but then the weather had warmed up and things had become quite slushy and muddy. And therein lies the danger to unsuspecting settlers.
The bark of the dogs froze into solid chunks and fell to the ground, while the lowing of cattle, the grunting of hogs, and the distressing cry of fowls filled the air full of icicles.
Oftentimes they're working in fields, they're traveling hither and yon, and find themselves wet. And then it becomes a matter of saving life and limb.
Everything which was exposed to the sudden change in the weather froze up. There was death in the barnyards of the pioneer farmers, and upon the wild prairies of the young state, the sudden freeze left its deadly sting.
Early settlers, though, were known for telling tall tales.
The weather was absolutely so cold that even the fire almost refused to burn.
Exaggeration is kind of the rule of the day.
3 of my horses were found dead. One of the animals was in the act of drinking, and when I discovered my loss, I noticed the water pail was frozen to the animal's nostrils. 2 cows froze stiff in their tracks, and towards night, when I drove them into the barn to milk them, they were dead. I'll tell you what, it was a stunner.
One typical account reads, quote, "The wind in its fury and power blew the water into little sharply defined waves, which froze as they stood." Might be hard to believe, but that's another common story you hear from settlers.
A story is told of two men who were on their way to Bloomington and were in the neighborhood of Little Vermilion Creek when the sudden freeze hove in sight. They hastened to the creek, but it was high and filled with moving ice. The men were 12 miles from any house, and rather than freeze to death, they determined to kill their horses, cut them open, crawl into them, and keep warm. The scheme, very unfortunately, was not successful, and both men lost their lives.
Now, we do know of one horrific story that is undoubtedly true, and that is of Andrew Heredith, who was from Sangamon County, and he was driving more than 1,000 head of hog to market in St. Louis, and he was caught on the open prairie. He and his fellow drovers, his men, were able to find refuge in a nearby cabin and save their lives, but they had to leave their hogs out in the open. The hogs that were left piled on top of each other, as hogs are wont to do, to seek warmth, of course. The next morning, Andrew Heredith, this drover, and his men found a pyramid of 500 dead hogs that had suffocated. Some of the stories of the sudden change we can believe, and some we have to cast kind of a curious eye.
Through the bitter frost and snow,